Welcome to Off the Couch. This is Dr. Greg Cason. Off the Couch, where psychology meets everyday life. Unfortunately, Zoe couldn't be here, our etiquette expert. She could not be here today because of an emergency, but filling in dutifully is producer Brian Gomez. Hello, Brian.
Hello, and happy Monday, Dr. Greg.
Happy Monday. Today on Off the Couch, we're going to talk in This Week in Psychology why a messy house causes anxiety, how being alone doesn't always lead to loneliness, as well as an innovative way to handle that when you do feel lonely, and how bullying affects some people worse than others. And also we're going to talk about a news item about a tragic event that happened this week in Alabama that's been completely shaded over by all the news that we're experiencing, and how psychology comes to intersect with this extremely tragic event. Hey, so Brian, tell me, are you overwhelmed by the sight of clutter in your house, like scattered papers, unwashed dishes, clothes in disarray?
Yeah, I'm one of those that I have to have my space clean in order to be able to be productive. I walk in, and if I start seeing mess, I'm like, oh, I don't even want to lay down because if I can see it, it's bothering me. So I'm one of those that if I want to have a good moment or a good time alone or with anybody, like it has to be, if somebody's coming over, it has to be spotless. But if I'm home, it still has to be peaceful and like enjoyable for me.
So I can tell you and I probably couldn't live together because I think I might be a little bit on the cluttered side. I think it's really true of people who are academic or, just who always live their life through information. I just collect articles constantly. I'm constantly wanting to read the paper, articles, books, all kinds of things around, and I just pile them up and sometimes forget where I've even put things. Sometimes my clothes don't go back in the bin. Sometimes I have dishes that wait till the next day. So I might be one of those people who causes you some stress. N'est-ce pas?
Yeah, the dishes for me though, that's my weakness. I hate doing the dishes. So for me, the dishes, and especially because they're not like visible or like in plain sight for me, and I don't let it pile up to an extreme amount, the dishes is the only thing that I get away with, like not being clean or, always organized. But I do get this sense of like happiness when I do organize, even for other people. I'm like, please just let me help.
Please do come over. Let's talk about why, for a lot of people, a cluttered house actually causes anxiety. There's a concept called cognitive overload, and the brain is constantly in a battle for attention, and it prefers actually to single task rather than to multitask. If you'll remember a few years back, everyone was saying how they could multitask. But in fact, we found that multitasking actually led to decreased performance in all areas, including the area that they were probably putting an emphasis on, as well as all other areas. If you just focus on one area at a time, you can do much better. And the order in the house actually reduces competition for the brain's attention, because when we see disarray in a house, our brain will attend to what's going on in the environment a bit more. So is this something that happens more with men or women? What do you think, Brian? Men or women? Who is most bothered by this?
I mean, I feel like most people are going to say women would be most bothered by it. But I feel like a lot of women are pretty messy. I hear that women are not the best roommates to have, especially with the restroom. I hear that's like the war zone for them, Goodness. So I would want to say the women, but not sure.
Oh, well, I don't know. I was once shocked when I moved into an apartment and the landlord told me as I was moving in, he goes, "Thank God you're a guy, because women put all that makeup in the sink." And I was standing there horrified that someone would actually say that, like put that bias right out there. But, that was his experience. But I think there might be a lot of unfair prejudice because he would soon find out that I would be a mess as well. So this was based on a study of 60 couples done by UCLA, and they published this in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. And this article was actually back from 2009, but I could not get it out of my head. I thought this was so interesting that I had to talk about it this week because it did come back up this week in another article. So I looked up the study and went down into the results. Let's talk about the effects of clutter. Women tend to respond. They are more bothered by this than men. And the problem with these gender studies, just to talk about, is when we look at gendered groups like women versus men, we typically don't break them down any further. We typically don't break them down into ethnicity, into socioeconomic, into sexual orientation, sexual identity. We don't break them down in any way. We just say, do you identify here as a man in the study or as a woman? And then we look at the results. So all of this needs to be taken with a grain of salt. But we saw that the women in the study tend to respond with higher levels of cortisol. That's the hormone related to stress. And they reported heightened depression symptoms. So we did see this. And when drilled down, the study authors actually thought this was due to a particular reason. And that's that the women in the study actually took more responsibility for the home than men did, and that men were not as embarrassed if they had someone come over if the place was a mess. And so women would think it would be a negative reflection upon them, and men often would not say the same thing. So it was kind of an interesting gender difference that I'm wondering, does that apply to you? That if the place is a mess, that you don't like people coming over?
Well, I can agree because I think it might be like the way I grew up, where I grew up in a Mexican household, and if your house wasn't spotless, it would be talked about. Like when, let's say if we went over to our neighbor's house or like another relative's house, and if it wasn't spotless, it would be a topic of conversation at some point with somebody else, you know? So it was very much like you're judged if your house isn't spotless. So if somebody's coming over, I have that like tendency to run around and make sure it's spotless, even though it's not the same environment or the same situation or the same time it was, you know, when I grew up like that. But it's just something engraved in my mind that I have to have it spotless, even if it's just friends, you know.
I grew up in a spotless house. I mean, spotless. I didn't even know dirt existed. And I never remember my parents ever talking about anybody else's house in a negative way. I don't know why, but I just don't remember it. So, yeah.
Must be nice. I'm a little traumatized from mine, so.
So let's talk about problem clutter. Problem clutter can be linked to OCD. So someone with OCD might be more prone to clutter. Someone with hoarding disorder, I don't think that's at all a surprise. Someone with major depression, and that can be very much a reflection of major depression, that people just start to give up. They don't have the energy to do things. They just, will sit back and just let things happen and things pile up. Could be due to ADHD or attentional deficits and anxiety disorders. So it could be due to multiple reasons. But the recommendation from the authors was a bit interesting, and I think it was spot on. They said, although there are ways to clean up clutter, and that could be a goal, and that is a goal for most, they also said don't aim for perfection, because real homes don't look like magazines. Perfectionism is linked to feelings of overwhelm, anxiety, and depression. So perfectionism, we all already know, is a problem, and it's a problem that leads to many issues. But actually feeling or believing your home should be perfect is a recipe for disaster, in much the same way clutter is a recipe for disaster. So let's talk about reducing clutter. Establish a routine. is probably the study authors recommended. They recommend that you have cleaning days. Well, always the weekend seems to be a cleaning day for me. To the clean as you go principle, which this I learned from Jackie Beat, who is a drag queen. She said, the secret is cleaning as you go. And if you've seen her apartment in the LA Times, there was a big spread on her. You know, this is someone who is very attentive to their environment, who lives in a very dynamic household, and who definitely lives up to that principle of clean as you go, because otherwise you'd be completely underwater. Also, micro tidying. This is something I recommend with my clients, is to tidy one place. So looking at something like a tabletop or a surface and doing one space at a time. And then that can actually help people to reduce clutter. Does that work with you, those kinds of things?
Yeah, for me, I'm one of those do it as you go. My bed has to always kind of be done in the mornings. If I don't do it, or if I feel like I'm having a habit of it, then I try to check on myself to make sure mentally if everything's good, because I feel like if I don't do my beds in the morning, it's a little sign of depression for myself in that sense. So I try to make sure I'm on top of that. And then, like you said, I don't clean my entire house all at once. I go little by little. When I see clutter or anything that's dirty, I'll do that area and then do another area later, but I don't go crazy with it. So I like to keep my environment as clean as possible most of the time, except the dishes.
Well, I want you to take comfort if there is a little clutter, because a little clutter may increase creativity. And we know that when you get a lot of clutter, a self-compassionate mindset like, you know what, I've had a hard day, I'm really tired, that can buffer the negative effects of having a cluttered environment and can help you rise to meet the challenge the next day. So that is that. Let's talk about being alone. I was struck, and I just saw this study this week. I was struck because a friend of mine said to me, we were out eating together, and she said, she felt so sorry for the woman behind us. She was eating dinner alone and reading a book. And I was perplexed. I said, I really saw it quite the opposite. I saw this woman as an empowered person who was taking herself out to dinner and reading a book and having a great time. We were at a great restaurant. It all made great sense to me. And my friend said she just sees someone out alone as a failure. What do you see when you see someone out alone, Brian?
I feel like when I was younger, it was a lot scarier to try to do things alone. I feel like I had to get to a point where I was comfortable enough being like, this is just for me. I am enjoying my time with myself at this point, and I have taken myself out. And there are thoughts that come across where I'm like, do people think I'm weird just out here sitting alone, having dinner by myself? Or I'll go out to lunch by myself a lot, actually, where it's sometimes it's easier to just go alone. You get to pick where you want to go, what you want to eat, when you want to do it on your time. So for me, it's a win, and I enjoy it. Sometimes I'll have headphones on or read a book while I'm eating, and it's just peaceful,
and I used to have a great time. I used to travel for work, and I do interviews with people in prisons all over the United States. We'll talk about that sometimes. But what was fun about that is I loved eating alone, and I inevitably would meet the wait person and talk to them, and just had a great time experiencing what was to me a new culture. I was often in very small towns and in unusual places. So that was always pretty wonderful. But if you're like my friend, if you're worried about being judged, there are people like my friend who sees everyone who eats alone as a problem. And I hope that this study breaks things for her. The University of Arizona just published a study this week in the Journal of Research and Personality. And they said that people don't actually feel lonely until they spend at least 3/4 of their time alone. So just being alone does not make you lonely. It's being alone a lot that actually has a more profound effect. When people go beyond 75%, it's actually difficult to avoid the feeling of loneliness, but most people never do. And in fact, they did find, I think the average, I'll have to find it, was 66% for most people. Most people spend a good deal of time alone, 2/3 of their time, but most people don't ever spend 3/4 of their time alone. So they really looked at some very intensive statistics to look at their every behavior every time. It was really quite an impressive study. They did find, though, that older adults, people 68 and older, tend to feel more affected by being alone, and that their social, it's maybe because in general people who are older have smaller social networks because, of course, people die and they're not quite as active in groups as they used to be. There's only a 3% overlap between being alone and loneliness. But people who are 67, over 67, that's the 68 and older group, apparently, the way they wrote this, but the 68 and older group had a 25% overlap between loneliness and being alone. So it seems to be more important that people who are older to not be alone. And that's, I wish I had actually, now I'm regretting that I didn't bring in another study that I saw this week that really talked about the benefits of visiting people who are older in their home, and that it gives them a huge boost. But that's maybe all you need to know. This study was done with 400 participants. They looked at archival data. That's data that was collected over the last 20 years. So it was a very intense study, but it was really quite impressive.
No, and that makes sense too, just because the older generation isn't at work. Like, we're going to work daily. We're being around people. We're talking to people on a daily basis. We have a lot more active friends, where it makes sense if they're not at work and constantly interacting with people, it will get lonely. I get lonely if I don't talk for, a certain amount of time. I'm like, okay, I'm going to start losing it soon.
Well, what's interesting for me is, as a therapist, I'm always on. Like, when I'm doing therapy, it's not about me, it's about them. And so I'm always attentive to their needs, and I'm thinking about them. I will talk about myself, and I'll be a normal person with them, but it's their time, and I'm very attentive to that. So when I come home, sometimes I like to isolate a bit more, or when I want to be around other people, I want to actually just hang out and listen and not like have the pressure. And for me, not talking sometimes with other people can feel less isolating than having to be on. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Just because you are not participating or not talking, like just hanging out and eating actually can be a really helpful thing.
No, that makes sense. I have a lot of days where I'll hang out with my best friend and absolutely not talk for hours, or we'll just watch TV or be on our phones at the same time, just in the same environment, eating, doing our own little thing, but we're just hanging out, and it's still fun, but we're not having to engage the entire time. And honestly, like you said, that's sometimes what we need.
Here's something that I didn't expect. It makes a lot of sense. Is that there's a very innovative way to cope with being alone that doesn't involve other people per se. It involves maybe being with them virtually. It's reading, writing, and sharing poetry. There's a study done by the University of Plymouth and Nottingham Trent University. So that this is over in England. People sharing, writing, and discussing poetry virtually did better during the COVID-19 pandemic. This study was published in the Journal of Poetry Therapy. Who knew that there was a Journal of Poetry Therapy? I have to love this one. And it helped many mental health symptoms, not just loneliness, and it helped other symptoms as well as depression and anxiety and grief. So really, writing, reading, and sharing poetry seems to be extremely important. By the way, you can find this at poetryandcovid.com. Well, it says now that it's been archived at poetryandcovidarchive.com. Fascinating, don't you think? It helped 51% of people felt that poetry helped them with loneliness, and 50% feel it helped them with anxiety and depression.
I love that. That makes sense too. It's almost like a form of music, and I feel like poetry is more of an emotional side of it, that you can't help but to feel that person's emotion and relate and feel some sort of connection with them in that sense.
I love it. I love it. I actually refer to people a lot to a website that I really like, and I'm going to give them a plug here. It's 750words.com. So 750words.com. And that is a website that just prompts you to write 750 words every day. And this is based on The Artist's Way. A lot of people will know this book, The Artist's Way. And The Artist's Way is to help people with their creative process, to be able to go forward. But one of the things the book does recommend is that people write 3 pages a day. It's especially helpful for writers. But I have people just go and write, and I give them that when they write first thing in the morning, and this is on the computer here, so some people prefer to handwrite, so the website wouldn't really work. But it's just writing whatever's in their mind. It can be how silly they think the exercise is. It could be the color of the room. But I just have them write whatever's in their mind, and many, many people find that to be a helpful exercise. So.
Ooh, maybe we should try that for this week as an assignment, and then see.
That's actually
if we can all do that. And
not
see what
a
we all
bad
feel
idea.
Like.
Not a bad idea. That's actually a good idea. So I'm going to make a hard right and talk about bullying. This is a very personal thing. I won't ask you if you've been bullied, but I certainly was during elementary school. I wouldn't say as much in high school, but definitely during elementary school. And it was very, very detrimental. And I deal with a lot of clients who come in with other things, but they often have a history of bullying. And some of them even have characteristics or suffer from PTSD as a result of the bullying. So it can be a very, very detrimental thing.
Yeah, I feel like I definitely experienced, luckily, a little bit of it in a way that I got a pass compared to a lot of other people in my situation that don't usually have it as good, I mean, I've seen other people get bullied. That's also a horrible thing to just witness as a kid and kind of not be able to do much. I mean, you can do something, but when you're a child and that's going on, you don't really fully understand the situation,
So true. It's interesting, and I just talked about the fact that I actually, another therapist that I worked with, actually in TV, said to me privately that she didn't think I should talk about anything that's happened in my childhood because people do tend to view that negatively, and I understand. But at the same time, I'd rather be there for the people who've been bullied to understand that I understand what it's like, and want them to know that there is a way through this. But let's talk about the effects of bullying. Students who feel that they've been victimized because of their social characteristics such as ethnicity and sexuality are at additional risk of trauma for bullying. This is a new study that just came out this week, done by Penn State University. It studied more than 2,200 young victims of bullying and published the findings in the Journal of School Violence. Gosh, that's an important journal. Bullied students were reported with more problems of physical health, self-esteem, social relationships, and academic performance, and they suffered worse if they felt there was bias behind their perpetrators' actions. So this is bias is things like any kind of social characteristics. It could be their size, their physical appearance, their attractiveness, their ethnicity, color, sexual orientation, femininity versus masculinity, height versus, tall versus short, obese versus thin, just all kinds of different things. These would be characteristics that are an example of bias. It's even worse if the person has more than one characteristic that's bullied, like if they're gay and black, or they're feminine and black, let's say, or they're obese and they're poor. So it can really get quite ugly. And I think kids will often identify a scapegoat or someone to really pick on, and that helps organize the social hierarchy when you're young. And there will be people who are really identified and hurt in sometimes a very irreparable way. Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought you had a comment there.
Oh, no, you're fine. It's true. It just... when you look at it, you already have these cards dealt against you, and then you have constant attacks from your peers that you want to be, so much alike them that when you're already standing out and you're being attacked for it, I mean, you can't process that, or you can't even process anything else other than that on your daily life, How do you learn? How do you excel as a child that way?
Yeah, and the students were asked in the past year, and I love this because I did a study on domestic violence, and I found that you can't just ask somebody if they've suffered domestic violence. You have to ask very specific questions. You have to ask about the acts themselves and had they experienced them within a certain period of time. That's exactly what these study authors did. So they followed this same method to identify bullying. And they asked if anyone had made fun of them, called them names, insulted them in a hurtful way, spread rumors, or tried to get others to dislike them, which is very familiar girl bullying, threatened, pushed, shoved, tripped, and spat on them, with this, which is familiar boy bullying, made them do something they didn't want to do, such as give up their food or their money, excluded them from activities, or had their property intentionally destroyed. All devastating things for a young kid to experience. They found that adolescent victimization motivated by bias, or so one of the characteristics we talked about earlier, had a unique impact, and people had more negative effects, especially on schoolwork. So if you're seeing schoolwork suffer, that's something to really pay attention to. So here, gender, race, religion, ethnic background, disability, sexual orientation, and physical appearance. They found that 25%, 1/4 of all students in the past year had suffered one of those acts. So this is not an isolated problem. This is a problem that happens to many kids. 25%, 1 in 4. Of those people who are victimized, 4 in 10, 20% of that group were motivated, or 40%, sorry, bad math, they felt that their bullying was motivated by bias, mostly related to their physical appearance, and 2/3 experienced being threatened or were the subject of a spreading rumor. It's absolutely devastating. Now, if due to bias, they were 3 times more likely to suffer negative effects on their self-esteem, and they were increased damage to their physical health, social relationships, and their schoolwork. And once again, girls suffered more than boys. But they did find one particular helpful act, which is inclusivity groups like Straight Gay Alliance clubs can be helpful. And I think this is really helpful because I remember an anti-bullying campaign that happened. I think GLAAD did it. I know it was well-meaning, but they did a campaign, or Glisten, I think it was Glisten. They said it was called That's So Gay. And they were telling people, don't be a bully, don't call people gay. Well, that's all very well and good, but some of the research done on these anti-bullying campaigns actually increase bullying. So what we see is it's more effective to create inclusivity groups, and that can actually ameliorate the effects, and also to identify people who are getting bullied and help them. So I think it's so silly to ask a bully not to be a bully, because most bullies don't think they're bullies. They actually do the negative act and then blame it on the victim. So it's actually more helpful to help the victim in those particular regards. So.
No, yeah, I mean, I think that's amazing. The inclusivity part is such a big key to it, because I feel a lot of the time we're just trying to fit in as a kid, you know? That's the whole point of our childhood. We just want to be liked by all of our friends and everybody we go to school with. So when that's not happening, on top of the bullying, it's already like the double stressors are just, yeah, like you said, it shows on the grades. Like, how is a child going to learn or, concentrate when they're constantly being attacked in their environment?
Yeah, well, I dove into my schoolwork, oddly enough. I think that's the other reaction. Don't. If your kid's getting all A's, there may be a problem too. Okay, Alabama mayor. I want to talk about this. This study came out about bullying, and then I saw this study that's made the news this week, but I think got buried by all the negative things that are going on in our society and what we're reporting, problems in the Middle East, etc., that are really taking all of our attention and time. This was the most tragic thing, and this is an example of bullying, but this was bullying of an adult. There's a mayor named F.L. Bubba Copeland of Smith Station in East Alabama. Can you put up the picture of that mayor by any chance? Dakota, thank you. That's Bubba right there. He's the mayor. He's a pastor. He's an owner of a local grocery store, husband and father. Looks like a really sweet guy. There's another picture of him. He's helping with they had terrible tornadoes in 2019, and that's him helping after the tornado damage which ripped through Alabama. And he was a beloved mayor and icon of this town. Also, on Wednesday, November 1st, a conservative website called the 1819 News, I'm sorry to even give them a nod here, but it was once owned by the conservative Alabama Policy Institute. So this is right-wing publication reflective of a right-wing group, revealed that Copeland used several social media accounts under a pseudonym and would dress in women's clothing and makeup and post pictures on the accounts. And this was his private life. This was an expression that he had. And 2 days after he posted this, he killed himself. It was really sad. Social media accounts described Bubba as a transgender. Here, his pseudonym, which I believe was Brittany, described him or herself as a transgender woman in the process of medically transitioning. So here she was expressing herself on these social media accounts, and they were very innocent, sweet pictures, honestly. I saw some of them. Copeland told the 1819 News when they contacted him about it that he was not doing so, that he was not transitioning himself, and that his wife knew of his private hobby. He apologized at a prayer service, said he was under internet attack, that the article is not who he is, and he apologized for any embarrassment caused by his private and personal life that had come out publicly. 2 days later, the 1819 News released another story about his social media post and some fictional stories produced under his pseudonym, some erotic fictional stories, and he killed himself a few hours after that. I mean, this was absolutely tragic.
It's just heartbreaking. It's another example of bullying, like you said, to a bigger extent, where I can't understand what somebody else that's, doing their own things in their own personal life that makes them happy. Like, how do people go out of their way to attack somebody that has done nothing to them? Like, what in their mind triggers it? Like, yeah, they might be different, but like, I don't understand how it goes to that extent where you're taking now time out of your day to like fully attack and create something fictional about somebody, to ruin their life.
I mean, it's so unfathomable to me, and this is such a problem in the LGBTQ community. Like with people who are trans have a much higher suicide rate, people who are gay, who are alternative in any way, who are gender expressing differently than what is the norm, all get identified generally, and they generally will experience a social exclusion, which we're going to talk about the devastating effects of that and how that actually created a heinous event like him committing suicide. Let me talk about him for a second. I think he sounds like an amazing guy. He lived in Smith Station, Alabama, most of his life. He operated a local grocery store. He was the second mayor of Smith Station ever. He was instrumental in creating or designating an historical site in the town. He created an outdoor community center. He created a public works department. He championed $1 million road improvement project in the town. He guided the city through the deadly tornadoes of 2019 that we saw the picture, and the COVID-19 outbreak. And, folks, he was the senior pastor at First Baptist Church in New Phoenix City. So this was a really dedicated guy who was very much a part of that town, a part of that community, and somebody decided to go after him in a very public and shaming way.
It just sucks to have somebody like such a good person be attacked for no reason by strangers, And it sucks because they don't pay any consequences to what they've done, or they kind of just hide behind the screen like they did absolutely nothing to this guy, And
yes.
You got to think about his family, like his loved ones. Like, this is a trickle effect, not just his own life,
Well, I did read later that the publisher is getting some flack from the people in the town about having done that and published him and shamed him, but he's just sort of standing up and being defiant and self-righteous. So it was bullies do.
Yeah.
Bullies blame the victim. They say it's his fault for doing the social media page, but the social media page, if they had never reported it, would have gone on existing. And this was an interesting thing to me, especially because I've had clients who are transgender who don't want to present publicly about with their gender in public, but they know that they are transgender, and they've actually found the internet to be an incredibly freeing place to be able to express themselves, to express that identity, which is different from their identity that they express in public. So I just think it's really an amazing thing that can happen, that people who once suffered in silence and isolation have found a community. And why can't we make room for that, especially for people who are so upstanding? An interesting thing is we call this event done by the 1819 News an outing, like they outed him. They put him out in public. And generally, outing has been somewhat socially accepted on politicians who say and do anti-gay things, pass anti-gay legislation, etc. Pastors who work in public and are very shameful or shaming of people who are gay. And most people who are focused on that issue tend, and it's not a surprise, we can look at Freud's concept of reaction formation, which is they feel ashamed of something inside of themselves, so they react against it, and they do these kinds of things like want to pass anti-gay laws, etc., and then in their private life are having gay sex or are transgender, etc. Bubba was none of those things. He was an upstanding citizen. He was never anti-gay or anti-trans. He was someone that was beloved in that town, and yet he was outed by this organization that just wanted to push their own agenda. So I don't know. I could say outing is nearly always a problem, but there was not even what is we might often look at as the reason for outing that happens. That didn't even exist here.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. They had no reason to even look into this person's personal life, you know? Like, I agree with you with where social media can be such a freeing space for those individuals that don't have that environment that they can fully express themselves. Yeah. But it sucks because it can be used against them like it did to this situation, you know?
Yeah, and so this brought me to wanting to talk about shame and guilt and the difference of these things and how detrimental shame can be, because there's no doubt that what happened with him, with Bubba, is that he was shamed to death. So let's talk about shame and guilt. Well, they often get mixed up. Guilt is really a belief you've done something wrong and you're bad for having done that wrong thing. So guilt can be a very detrimental and negative thing. And we can talk about the iterations of guilt. I often suffer from Catholic guilt. It's, the stain that goes around in my life. But guilt can be a very problematic thing. But shame is something very different. And this is very common within the LGBTQ community. It's also common in any kind of people who are somehow perceiving a characteristic about themselves as bad or wrong. So when we go back to that bullying story, you see that they can often feel that shame as well. The shame is a belief that you are something wrong, that something you did or a characteristic about you is now somehow identified with you, and that you are wrong. You're a bad person for being that thing, and that you believe you're a bad that others believe you're a bad person. That's the key, is that others believe you're a bad person and will reject you. So what you feel, even in the absence of anybody knowing about it, you feel humiliation and you expected rejection. So shame's it's not even required that other people know that you're that thing. Shame will keep you silent. So shame is an incredibly detrimental and problematic thing. And there's no doubt that when someone is shaming another person, like that news outlet did to this man, how detrimental and reflected probably the shame he already was dealing with daily inside. And instead of doing negative things, he channeled the difficulty in his struggle into such a positive contribution for his entire community. So shame is definitely a problem. And I think evolutionarily wise, I look at shame and guilt kind of differently too. Guilt will make us want to change our behavior. We feel bad about a behavior. We want to change. We want to apologize to the person that we did wrong. We want to be there for the person. But shame makes us want to retreat. Shame makes us want to go away. Shame makes us want to run because we feel that humiliation. Shame can also affect quite the opposite. People can feel rage. So if you're a narcissist, let's say, your life is often ruled by shame because you know you're not as great as you keep telling everyone you are. And that you, anytime you're confronted with that reality, you then can have a rageful reaction. And that can actually create quite the opposite. So...
I mean, I agree. I mean, it's just interesting to hear you talk about the differences of them, and I can replay, and I'm like, wow, I can see how, I mean, just being shamed into something, you can carry the guilt into something else, and it can just spiral from there. So it just makes sense where people end up hurting themselves, or, I mean, it gets to the point where people are being attacked now in the streets, you know?
It's really disgusting. I mean, I have to say, as a psychologist, what's horrible to me is what's going on in our society right now. So we already know of this problem with the LGBTQ population. Now we're seeing this increase in anti-Semitism, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli. It's insane. And people would step back and just listen and understand. I could see. But all these people are taking sides and attacking other people. That's what's happening. And we're seeing, people put up hostage posters. And I was watching videos the other day of people ripping down the hostage post. And I was thinking, what? Like, why would you? It didn't make any sense to me because I don't know why they would rip that down. But I'm sure someone will come after me for saying I didn't make any sense to me. But at the same time, I can understand people not liking what's going on in Gaza. That makes a great deal of sense to me. But I don't understand the other. Why we can't make room to appreciate the complexity of this situation, to understand there's pain on both sides.
It's just weird to see how much we've turned against each other in that sense, where just because we're different in any little sense, we are trying to group ourselves with our people similar to us, and anybody not like us, it seems to be like a threat, or the whole side situation. I hate it because it's not one side or anything,
So I agree with you, and that I think is part of the problem, and the solution therein lies, because I saw Barack Obama doing a speech, talking, and I was so impressed how he viewed this whole situation. But he was saying that he sees social media in a positive way. Like, social media is obviously, and it's done by trolls and bots and all these and algorithms, which are causing people to square off against each other. It's a pretty negative thing. So I luckily have just stayed off it. I don't want to see it because it's very problematic. I don't want to be a part of hate. What I do see is, and I saw Barack Obama, and I was very impressed with what he said. He was basically talking about how social media made his campaign, that was probably one of the primary reasons he got elected. But he also said, but social media was very different back then, and mostly it was MySpace.com, if you guys remember that. I do. And we all had the same friend, which was very interesting, if any of you know that reference. And then we also Meetup, which I never did a Meetup, but apparently that really helped fuel Barack Obama's campaign. That was the president, by the way, a couple presidents back. If you don't know who I'm talking about, I hope you do. But he actually said the key there was you had to meet up. You had to actually go someplace and meet people unlike yourself. who were interested in this particular cause, and that caused people to really open up. And I remember when I had worked on political campaigns, that was exactly my experience, that I would go and door knock and I'd talk to people who were unlike me. I started in high school. I did stuff when I was in elementary school. I was very, very weird kid. But the bottom line is meeting people who express different opinions actually helped me. It helped me to understand. It helped me to have compassion. It helped me to know other people's experience, and I didn't fault them for having a different experience. It helped me try to find ways to talk with them and to be with them.
No, I completely agree with that. So in my military experience, I had to deal with the same situation where I had to learn and understand that we all come from different places in the States, sometimes out of the country, and we're all brought up differently. We're all exposed to different things, and some of the people's, I don't want to say ignorance, but like them not being exposed to certain things in life, you can have a little bit more compassion to them, to being like, they just don't know. You know, it's not them sometimes being hateful. It's just they truly don't know, have never been exposed to that. So understanding that for me from different avenues of different lives helped me grow and understand their lives and see how they were brought up and how their brain and mind works, so I can interact with them in a professional way too.
So you are wearing an Edward Monk T-shirt. And that's from the Edward Monk Museum. You said that was from Abercrombie and Fitch, but I said, "Oh, did someone bring you that shirt?" Because I went to that museum this summer, and it's weird we're on this topic. We were talking about poetry, etc., because in this museum it was absolutely fascinating, and this is the power of art. Is that stuff was so different. And his paintings were so full of pain and rage and just desolate, and it really made you wonder about what was going on with him, etc. He was an amazing, fascinating, extremely talented painter. But what was especially interesting to me was talking to people who we were, one of the few Americans there, and having to ask people what things meant, because I didn't understand the captions or the titles, and so I would ask people, "Can you interpret that?" Like blah blah blah. They spoke English. People were so gracious, but I was floored by the universal experience. I mean, I understand that, but I was floored once again by the universal experience. It doesn't matter what culture, et cetera, you're in. People are people everywhere you go, and they're good, generally wonderful people most of the time, and people suffer, like we saw in Edward Monk Museum. So that was kind of a fun surprise to see that T-shirt today.
It was meant to be a part of the topic. I wore it just for you.
Well, that brings us to a close. Why don't, I think that's good advice that you gave, Brian, that people can try the 750words.com. I give that to my clients. I think it's very helpful. I actually tell them journaling is a very it's a universal homework you can do that helps you on a daily basis, helps you reflect with yourself, helps you just get things out of your head, helps clear the cobwebs so that you can be there for other people and be there for yourself and be there for life itself and to experience things more fully. So I think it's a good thing to do.
I'm definitely going to try it.
Okay, so good. I'll ask you next time.
Check in with you guys next week.
I don't forget.
Yeah.
So until next week, hopefully Zoe can be with us next week. Thank you, Brian Gomez, for being here. Be present. That's not it. That's a different thing. I want you to be present, be flexible, and be kind people, and we look to you next time. Farewell.